guns, and money. Send lawyers, guns, and money.
Welcome to a special Election Day episode of Conduct Detrimental, the sports law podcast. Today, we take a detour on the road of sports law and take a look at how tomorrow's elections, both on the federal presidential level, as well as on the state level, how that could have an impact and potentially reshape or shape the laws around the sports industry and the sports gambling industry. Joining me, as always, is my compatriot and patriot, Daniel Lust, of the law firm of Garagos and Garagos. He writes for Forbes. I write for The Athletic. I have my own law firm. You know all that. With that out of the way, how are you doing today, Dan?
I'm freezing here, Dan. I don't know what people are feeling around the country, but at least in New York, it is like bone-chilling cold today. Dan, it's a big day in the country. This episode will come out. Maybe it will come out Monday, Tuesday, but wherever you are. I don't remember, at least in my lifetime, an election that seems to have so much hanging in the balance, at least from a societal level. I don't remember it being this, tied up, but, it's definitely going to be entertaining one way or the other.
Yeah, well, they say that every 4 years. This is the most important presidential election of our lifetime. When haven't they said that, actually? But I think this time, it rings true in a lot of areas of society. We've sort of reached a cauldron in our political and social world of things are on a real hot boil right now, race relations, law enforcement, but we're not going to tackle those. This is not, the Lincoln Project, and it's not a political show, but nonetheless, elections have consequences in other areas of American life. And we're going to focus on where we think or how we think tomorrow's election results could impact different areas of the sports industry and the growing industry of sports wagering, which are both of our areas of focus, both to talk about and in practice. So Dan, where would you like to start off? I mean, Trump, that was 2004. Trump versus Biden. Where do you see the most likely impact in the sports industry, depending on who wins?
So I think, I guess for a little rough roadmap, so we have some, kind of roadmap or skeleton for today. I think the three things, Dan, that you and I have kind of both identified as areas that could be affected by the election. Number one, which I've spoke a lot about, is name, image, and likeness. I think we should get into. Number two, this fun lawsuit, Dan, that you and I spoke about not so long ago, this baseball minor leaguers lawsuit, which might come up to the Supreme Court. It's not so far-fetched, especially if it's going to reach the federal levels. That's also something we should talk about with this concept of court packing and all that. That's going to affect the intermediary federal courts. And number three, Dan, I think something that obviously you're we'll say the sports betting guru, as our friend Darren Rovell once said. I think it's there. I think sports betting is going to be impacted a lot. And I think, Dan, maybe a fourth topic we can fit it in. I was thinking about it this morning when we had Darren Rovell on the podcast not so long ago for our 50th episode. Darren Rovell predicted that a lot of sports teams would be sold in the upcoming future. And I know just from my little bit of research on this, that if Trump wins, the tax plan is going to be one thing, and if Biden wins, the tax plan is going to be another. That could have a very big influence on teams being sold because of the tax ramifications of those sales. So that being said, Dan, I think we should take our first road stop in the name, image, and likeness world. I'll give you a quick background, then I have some, I want to hear your thoughts, and we'll try to keep this episode fairly tight. So, I've spoke about this time frame in the past, and our friend Darren Heitner has been very intimately involved in the Florida landscape. So really about a year ago is when, at least in the college world, politics and sports started to be blended together. And that's back in November of 2019, California passed this fair pay to play, which was, even back in 2019, very rare to have a bipartisan issue. It passed with basically unanimous support in both houses in California. And it basically allowed this entrepreneurship license, California, for their athletes within the state, be it Stanford, UCLA, USC, those athletes to make money off their name, image, and likeness. So they weren't going to actually have that into effect until 2023, but nevertheless, that's the first one that passed. So the next couple months, now we're about a year out, a lot of different states passed laws. The one we're going to focus on is Florida's, because Florida, theirs comes into effect in July of 2021. So keep that in mind. If that occurs, and Florida's the only one of the 50 states that has name, image, and likeness laws, that's a very big recruiting edge. So on your sports brain, just keep that in mind. The two hurdles that we have to get over before that, number one, the NCAA coming up with their own name, image, and likeness rules, which could preempt what Florida does. There's going to be some issues then. I know Dan and I, I've spoke about it a number of times that what the NCAA does might be violative of antitrust law. Now, the NCAA is hoping, I think, that the federal government comes in with their own federal name, image, and likeness laws. And there are at least two bills that are at the federal level that are being proposed, and they're being put up to vote. It's just essential boilerplate language. It's not going to run foul of antitrust laws because obviously the federal government's doing it. Now, Dan, I'll turn it over to you with this. At some point in time when those were put together, those were facing, let's say bipartisan, looked like they were going to be unanimously approved. But what happens after November 3rd, you can have Democrats and Republicans not so nice anymore, and these bipartisan bills could kind of fall apart at the seams, which then leaves a world, Dan, where we're relying solely on the NCAA to come up with their own rules in order to stop Florida's big recruiting edge. So, Dan, I'll turn it over to you. What are your overall thoughts on this, we'll say, looming mess?
Well, the election day results, I don't think are going to bring Capitol Hill to a standstill just because of the fireworks going on with the impeachment proceedings and just the temperature in Washington right now. It's not as if they're going to stop passing bills and passing legislation. And name, image, and likeness seem to be gathering momentum as a bipartisan measure. And I don't think it matters really too much who wins tomorrow's election between Biden and Trump as to whether that hastens the pace of potential federal legislation. I mean, even President Trump has signaled strong support for athletes' rights as evidenced by his, behavior, his statements, and his influence over the Big Ten returning to play. I mean, if he's going to be an advocate of student rights or student athlete rights in one area, and as a businessman, as someone who's built his fortune on name, image, and likeness, I would expect President Trump to be encouraging and supportive, ultimately, of any bipartisan or even partisan legislation that would create a uniform framework for name, image, and likeness. Because all these state bills that spring into life at different points in time, it does create a potential unlevel playing field competitively and opens those pieces of legislation to potential legal vulnerability from lawsuits filed by the NCAA. So I think we're on our way to a federal solution, but maybe not anytime immediately or within the next 6 months to 1 year. But I think regardless of the office holder, I think the train has left the station on name, image, and likeness. And, I would expect federal congressional efforts to quicken the pace over the course of the next year. And we might see some consensus around that during the next presidential term.
So just kind of one note, Dan, I kind of, I hope this is not the case. I hope that we have some certainty in our country as to who the president's going to be. But you read the news enough, I don't think we're going to have a clear winner when it comes to November 4th even. So we'll see. We'll see how much this is hung up, but I do think it's an important decision. Sports
betting is on the ballot on Election Day in 3 different states: Louisiana, Maryland, South Dakota, and of course, that's the statewide ballot in those states. But the federal election for the presidency could have repercussions as well, on the potential for federal legislation around sports betting. And at the very least, the current Wire Act lawsuit that's playing out in the First Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. So let's start with the 3 states that are holding statewide voter referenda. During the first couple of years in the post-PASPA environment, most states were able to pass sports betting legislation as a matter of statutory enactment. But as we get into the more difficult part of the schedule, a number of the remaining states have these constitutional provisions that contain broad prohibitions against either gambling outright or certain types of gambling, which encompass things like sports wagering. So in Louisiana, Maryland, South Dakota, those are 3 states that had state constitutional prohibitions that need to be amended in order to permit sports wagering to be adopted by the state legislature. And In each of those states, sports betting is on the ballot today. Maryland is an important state to watch because that's the home of the Orioles, Pimlico Racetrack, MGM Grand Harbor. It is expected to be one of the more lucrative states, certainly on the eastern seaboard for gambling, for sports betting. South Dakota goes on the ballot today for sports betting, not statewide, but only in Deadwood, Montana, and in Louisiana. The one difference there is that the referendum occurs on a county by county or parish by parish basis. So you can have some parishes or counties approve sports betting by popular vote, and in others, the citizenry rejects it. So you could have a fractured state along those lines, but it is expected that New Orleans, the county that encompasses New Orleans, which already has casino gambling to some extent, they will likely approve sports betting as a ballot question. But despite the favorable polling and the lack of any formulated opposition to sports betting, if we look at past precedent in a state like Colorado, which is now full guns a-blazing for sports wagering, it has taken off like wildfire. If you recall, 1 year ago, that measure, I forget the name of the amendment or the proposition, but the sports betting measure narrowly passed with less than, I think, 100,000 votes separating no's from yeses. So it was like a 51 or 50.5 to 49.5 outcome. And in New Hampshire, which also had, I guess, city by city, town by town referenda, roughly half the towns approved it and the other half rejected it. So I don't think it's any sure thing that each of those three states will approve sports betting at the polls, but it's certainly worth watching to see if last year's close calls at the ballot box are mirrored this time around and whether any of these amendments are defeated at the polls. But we're certainly marching inexorably towards greater expanded legal sports wagering in the United States. Dan?
Yeah, you might track this obviously closer than I would, but is there any kind of correlation, at least what I'm curious, whether you're a blue state or you're a red state, whether that either being a blue or red makes you more likely to have legalized gambling within your jurisdiction?
That's a good question. I think just like name, image, and likeness, sports wagering and gambling generally has become counterintuitively more of a bipartisan issue. Certainly historically, conservative politicians, conservative lawmakers, some of the Bible Belt states, they're anti-gambling. But sports wagering, I think, has attracted, in the states that have adopted it, bipartisan support. And I think the real litmus test isn't blue state, red state. It's whether your state already has a lot of gambling. So, quarter of a century ago, there were only 2 or 3 states that had casino gambling. Now there were over 40. So in most of those states, the gambling question has already been decided. It now becomes a matter of how much do you want to expand gambling further in those states? And the gateway provided by Daily Fantasy Sports, which is now legal, expressly made legal in over half the states, I think that is a good comparator in forecasting the likelihood of state legislatures and voters wanting to move sports betting forward in their state. So I think it's a question of how much gambling already exists. And Montana has a lot of gambling already in Deadwood. And by limiting sports betting to Deadwood, you're just essentially adding another vertical within a location that already has gambling. But the interesting sidebar to that is that while the citizens are voting on sports betting in Deadwood, what will likely happen in the aftermath is that the legislature will approve mobile wagering on a statewide basis, because in a number of states that have geographic limitations or restrictions on whether gambling can take place, the legislatures have been able to kind of work around those and circumvent those by requiring that the servers be located in the geographic areas where casino gambling has to be conducted. So if you have a server in Deadwood, you could have a citizen in Butte, Montana, placing a mobile wager, and the wager is deemed to occur at the location of the server in Deadwood. So I think this is step one of a 2-step process under which Montana will have full-scale mobile wagering within a year.
So just one quick note, and then we'll transition to our third topic. I didn't mention the NCAA's proposed name, image, and likeness guidelines do not allow athletes to have endorsement deals or marketing deals with industries that they feel to be prohibitive. So we'll say alcohol, cannabis, and gambling. So Dan, you mentioned Colorado has legalized gambling within its jurisdiction. And Colorado University signed a big lucrative marketing deal with a gambling company. But as under our first topic, the NCAA's rules wouldn't allow the Colorado quarterback to come up with a deal for a gambling company because they view that as being prohibited. So I think we're making some progress on sports betting, even in the vernacular, even in what in what our country views as something that should be favored. So
there's one other important dimension, Dan, to sports betting. I didn't mean to go on so long on the state referenda and the state ballot questions. The identity of our next president will go a long way to determining what the fate of the current Wire Act lawsuit, will be like. Because right now, elections have consequences. And when Donald Trump was elected to the presidency in 2016, one of his biggest financial supporters and boosters was Las Vegas Sands casino owner Sheldon Adelson, who has been on a sort of a journey and a mission, a warpath to criminalize online gaming. And the suspicion is that Sheldon Adelson has influenced the Department of Justice's policy with regard to the Wire Act. And historically, the Wire Act has been viewed as applying only to the interstate transmission of sports bets. And it does not apply to any other category of gambling, such as, lottery sales, iGaming, iCasinos, slot machines conducted over the internet. And the New Hampshire Lottery has challenged that reinterpretation of the Wire Act by the Justice Department. And to date, the New Hampshire Lottery has been successful in federal court in forestalling the application of that new Wire Act interpretation by the Justice Department. Yet the Trump administration has persisted and has appealed that ruling to the First Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. And on our podcast last week, we talked about how the death of one of the three judges on that panel may slow up the decision-making process around that decision. But I'll take it one step further. If Trump is not reelected and Biden becomes the office holder, I think the Justice Department will quickly drop the appeal on that lawsuit, because Senator Biden and Vice President Biden hails from the state of Delaware, which is one of only a handful of states that have legal online gambling, and Delaware participates in these interstate compacts with Nevada and New Jersey that could be under threat of criminal enforcement if the Department of Justice does not change its view on the Wire Act. So I would expect a Biden administration to immediately bring any appellate efforts around that lawsuit to a halt. The issue will go away, and Biden's Justice Department will reinterpret the Wire Act to mirror the Department of Justice's original interpretation in 2011. And then, of course, we have, I'll just address this very succinctly. The rumors of federal sports betting legislation have been around for several years. There was a bill that was co-sponsored by former Senator Hatch and current New York Senator Chuck Schumer that has not gone anywhere in the past year. I don't think it goes anywhere under a Trump administration, and it's even less likely to go anywhere with Senator Biden in the office of the presidency, because he's from one of the states that was one of the earliest launchers of state authorized sports betting. And I don't believe he would be supportive of any federal efforts to interfere with that state sovereignty, given where he comes from and his loyalties to the state of Delaware.
Pop quiz, Dan. Who's the most famous quarterback to come out of Delaware?
Oh, that has to be Joltin' Joe Flacco.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I don't know if there's anyone more famous, but
okay.
Super Bowl champ. Okay, Dan, so let us transition to our third topic. We'll be pretty tight on this one. So we had Garrett Brocious on our podcast a couple weeks back. Garrett Brocious is the former minor league baseball player that went into the law and is now suing. He's representing the lead plaintiff suing Major League Baseball. In that debate, they're obviously challenging federal minimum wage law, but at a larger point, what's being challenged is basically baseball's ability to do whatever they want. That's maybe not so normal of a normal business, right? McDonald's can pay their cashier minimum wage, but baseball doesn't have to. They have to pay their minor leaguers some form of a stipend. So I think, the reason we bring this up, it's not every day we have a sports case that touches the Supreme Court. We had this one, they denied the appeal for Major League Baseball. So I think it's a case there's so much money in the line that, Dan, it could get very well back to the Supreme Court. But that being said, Dan, what I want your kind of thoughts on, we keep hearing the term court packing. Whoever wins is going to pack the court. And it's not really, you don't have to worry about the Supreme Court anymore because Judge Barrett was appointed. But now what you have to worry about is that intermediary level of federal judges that are going to help, not going to help, but they're going to be ruling over this case. And obviously there's also the NFL Antitrust DirecTV case that's going to be involved. So Dan, what are your overall thoughts on, how baseball's antitrust exemption and NFL, maybe we'll talk if you have it, the NFL's antitrust challenge, how that will be impacted by the results of this election?
Yeah, sure. That's a great, subject, Dan, and it covers and potentially covers a lot of terrain here. Certainly if Donald Trump is reelected, the composition of the Supreme Court and lower federal courts is going to remain, the way it is and probably become even more conservative leaning. But if Senator, I keep saying Senator, former Vice President Biden wins the White House and the Democrats control the Senate and maybe even the House of Representatives, although the Senate confirmations are what matter for the federal judiciary, with a basic monopoly over the executive and legislative branches, I would expect, people use the word court packing, but I think what we're looking at is the potential and likelihood of an expanded federal judiciary at the federal district court level, Intermediate Court of Appeal level, and why not the Supreme Court? I mean, with the number of cases that the court turns away every year, they only hear like 1% of all the petitions, measured in dozens of cases, and by comparison, our intermediate federal appellate courts hear so many more controversies that I think the courthouse door is largely closed to Supreme Court to Supreme Court litigants, unless you're represented by the Ted Olsons, the Paul Clements, or you have like the perfect case. So with democratic control of the of the executive branch and the legislative branch, I think we're seeing the day where we could have a few more justices, maybe 4 more, 2 more, and of course, more impactfully, the intermediate appellate courts is where all the action is. I mean, if you remember back in 2000, I think it was 2011, the National Football League Players Association in that Brady lawsuit got a court-ordered injunction from a Minnesota federal district court judge to basically end the owner's lockout. And that victory was short-lived because it was overturned by the 8th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. It never went to the Supreme Court. And likewise, in the Tom Brady Deflategate case, the Adrian Peterson case, the last line of attack, so to speak, was the federal intermediate appellate court. So I would expect that over time, even if the Democratic Party controls those branches of government for even one term, 4 years, 6 years, I would expect the pendulum to swing back with more liberal judges, more judges that might favor or might be more labor leaning than management leaning, and that could raise a whole host of that could essentially swing the balance of power on judicial decisions, reaching labor management relations. But let's drill down on Congress for a second. Last year, we had a Congress that passed America's, Save America's Pastime, which essentially dealt a blow to minor league baseball players by making, I guess, Major League Baseball exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I think one of the first do-overs that we could see if Congress is in Democratic control is to see that legislation rewound or rescinded and revert back to the pre-Save America pastime status quo. And, I think this also calls into question whether Congress might want to write with a heavy hand and further chip away at baseball's historic federal antitrust exemption, which was created in a U.S. Supreme Court decision almost a century ago. But in 1998, the Curt Flood Act pared that back, and now the exemption only applies, I think, to minor leagues, franchise relocation, and maybe one other area, I forget which offhand. But we're in the time now, and this is an era of American life where I don't think subtlety will be the watchword. I believe that there could be seismic changes in how Congress might view baseball's antitrust exemption.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward. I mean, I'm looking forward to see what the years that come. I think as we've gotten further along, baseball, the reasoning for having a antitrust exemption alone for baseball doesn't really make sense to me. So we'll see what comes of it. Dan, and last but not least,
football doesn't have one. Basketball doesn't have one.
You don't.
It's this sacred cow where, you know, a century ago, baseball was truly America's pastime. And I think it's been eclipsed by football, and certainly basketball is now a global sport. It's become an anachronism that ultimately will find the right controversy to chip away at that. And I think the dispute and the lawsuits and litigation and movement around minor league baseball salaries might be the linchpin that affects change either in the courts or through Congress. So I think the antitrust exemption from baseball might be pared away even in the next 4 to 6 years. It's possible, but it's been on the books for almost 100 years. But I do want to give credit to Darren Rovell for. Well, yeah,
let's tee it up appropriately. So we had Darren on about 15 episodes ago at this point, episode 50. Darren gave us a really kind of broad prediction, and he said that in the next, I think he said 12 months, that a lot of teams would be sold, especially family-owned teams. Dan, you posted that clip. You had it as your pinned tweet for a couple of weeks. That had about a couple of months. I had about like 50,000 views, and people were trying to rip on Darren, saying that's not true. These teams aren't going to be sold. So Dan, all of a sudden, we maybe get a team or two sold a year. The Mets have been sold. The Jazz are about to be sold. There's rumors that the Orioles are going to be sold. All of a sudden, there's all this upheaval. And, I want to give a quick shout out to John Nucci, the president of Penn State Sports Law Program, who pointed out something really interesting that kind of caught my attention. And it makes sense, right? The people are like conservatively, when it comes to finance, under the Trump tax plan, right? You can basically, it's beneficial to the wealthy. So Steve Cohn and the Wilpons, they wanted to get their deal done before there's a change in leadership, potential change in leadership in the country to save potentially millions of dollars. So that's why all of a sudden, right, you're hearing all these whispers of teams, and it's probably, maybe Darren predicted it, but there's a reason and an impetus to get the sale done before there's a change in leadership. So if you're watching we'll say the odds on these offshore accounts for the Trump versus Biden election, I think I saw minus 250 for Biden and plus 160 for Trump. So, the odds are kind of showing that there's going to be a change in leadership. And that's why, these smart businessmen are at least floating the potential sale of their teams. And I do not think that is a coincidence by any means.
Yeah, well, I think a fair number of them might not be outright sales to third parties at arm's length. Some of these transactions might be to affiliated entities. It's almost similar to, I guess a generation ago, Nelson Doubleday tried to transfer his half share in the New York Mets to another family entity, and Fred Wilpon, exercised the right to match. There was a right of first refusal in their original agreement, but I think rather than have outright sales, we could see interfamily transactions or sales to family trusts. But I think Darren, by and large, has been right, but his focus was on COVID-19, but now COVID-19 and the uncertainty created by both that and a potential Biden, tax plan, I think could hasten or ramp up the pace at which sports franchises are sold. They're losing revenue. Many of these, like team ownerships that are family, like the Maras and a number of other team owners whose businesses center around hotels and hospitalities. There are a number of them that are going to be in the cash crunch, and might use the disposition of their sports assets, to raise money and to offset the losses in their other businesses. So I would expect to see more of these, and who knows which ones will be the next group. But Darren was onto something. And, he was called out by a number of people for being overly aggressive on his prediction.
He wasn't wrong.
No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't.
So speaking of Darren, and then I guess Dan, we'll put this in the books. I want to give Darren, friend of the show, a shout out. Was referenced by President Trump this past week.
Oh my God.
Quote, who is Darren Rovell? Darren noted that Jack Nicklaus, famous golfer, had supported Trump, and Rovell wrote, this is one of, I think he wrote, I'm not sure, something along the lines of that's the most polarized decision or statement that Nicklaus ever made, which Darren phrased it, I think, in a fair way. But Clay Travis snapped back, and then we know Clay Travis through the Big Ten situation knows Trump, and Trump, I guess, doesn't know Darren Rovell, so it says, who is Darren Rovell? But our friend of the show, Darren, in only the way Darren can, found probably a 10-year-old picture of Trump and him interviewing Trump for something with MSNBC. So there's something that they know each other. And Dan, before we...
He should trademark. Darren, being a sort of a guru of branding and trademarking, he should trademark. Who is Darren Rovell?
We should call other friend of the show, Darren Heitner.
Darren. Right. The Darren team, but he could have his own personal website and have a merchandise or a store, an online store, and just sell who is Darren Rovell, and who is Darren Rovell. I think only Darren and maybe a few immediate members of his family might buy it, but I'd buy it. But that was one of the great shout outs.
A good shout out
in the history of sports law and sports business. It doesn't get better than that. Love or hate President Trump. That was a signal accomplishment by a sports business person to get on the Twitter radar of President Trump, who has like a gazillion followers.
I want to just note one more thing, and I think we'll put it in the books. When we were in the Big Ten conversation, Dan, you and I were right in the heart of that conversation. President Trump, and he said it during the debates, that he saved Big Ten football, whether you want to believe it or not. And the reason, at least as some have pointed out, the reason he wanted to inject himself into that debate was because Big Ten country is a lot of these swing states, be it Ohio and be it Pennsylvania. So in the next 48 hours, we'll figure out how much Trump, at least claiming to save Big Ten football, will have had a factor. And Dan, just a quick shout out to my new friends over in Nebraska, who I guess I'm their, I think I'm an adopted Cornhusker at this point. Don't mess with Nebraska is all I'll say. Dan, do you have anything else before we put this in the books?
Yeah, Nebraska, they may have won the battle, but ultimately they could lose the war, especially given their poisonous or at least worsening relationship with their, some of their fellow Big Ten schools. And, we could devote a whole show to the wisdom of returning to play in light of the resurgence of COVID-19 in so many states, and, the positive tests that are being revealed in the pro football as well as collegiate football. Trevor Lawrence, in particular, is going to miss 2 games due to COVID-19, and I think we're really, we're playing with fire here to assume that every athlete COVID-19 test will lead to 1, a quick recovery, and 2, no long-term health consequences. I think that's a parlay that I would never want to have action on my own life. And I pray that none of these students, who aren't paid, professional athletes, do make a choice. They have their unions, representing them and bargaining on their behalf. Collegiate players have no advocates other than, their fans and their agents and people like us who are commentators, and they're taking a risk with their health and a risk with their life by going back on the field for the uncertain prospect and promise of having a career in the National Football League. How many Nebraska players get drafted every year and make the league?
A lot, all of them.
Well, I think the number was 0 2 years ago.
It was, but I do want to push back a little bit. Then I know, we're running out on time, but I will say it does swing both ways. The only thing that I really have a problem with on the COVID level on Big Ten, if Trevor Lawrence is not well enough to come back to the field for 2 games, fine. That's on him. It's and everyone's dealing with COVID is going to be a little bit different. What I don't like is that the Big Ten came up with this, what I'm going to call a very lazy 21-day plan that no matter who you are, no matter how your symptoms are, no matter how many negative tests you have, if you have COVID-19, you're out for 3 weeks at a minimum. which I think it was, we spent so much time talking about how much went into these safety protocols. No one in the country, Dan, any conference, has a mandatory 3-week period to sit out. And that, Dan, is what cost Wisconsin a game. And it might end up costing the Big Ten more games, which just, I don't think was right. And I know Urban Meyer commented this weekend that the Big Ten is going to look into possibly changing that and making it a more nuanced approach. Maybe it should be longer than 3 weeks, but it shouldn't be 3 weeks for everyone. And I don't really think that's fair when there's competing for a national championship, Dan. If Justin Fields has 3 negative tests after 1 positive test, I don't know if that's fair that he should be out for 3 weeks automatically. That's just my
fairness has never entered into while it should enter into decision making. Fairness is certainly a laudable goal. These are private associations, and the last couple of months it seems to have empowered so many of us with an opinion to basically tell a private association how they should be conducting their affairs. And I think we do need to devote another episode to this, because with every new case, every new positive test, and the way things are trending in a number of these states, I think I don't know that we'll know the final outcome and the long-term health consequences for a number of years. But I would definitely not commend the Big Ten for how they've handled this, but they're not putting profit first. They're putting health and safety first, and the way that they're implementing these rules may be open to question, but certainly it's not out of greed.
It also might not be out of competence either, but Dan, we'll save that for a different day.
Sure, you got it.
That being said, we'll put this one in the books, and as always, Dan Wallach is on social media at Wallach Legal. Myself, Dan Lust, at Sports Law Lust. The show, Conduct Detrimental, at Con Detrimental. For Dan and myself, we will see you next week on another episode of Conduct Detrimental.